there's a whole mystery that to me is incredible about, works from the past. And unlocking some of that mystery, I think, is like phenomenal to think about, like, the intersections that they did, or the way their shapes lock in together and how particular the shapes are. So, I went through basically, God, when I was at the studio school, 3 years where transcriptions were kind of drilled into us about structure, about underlying, things to look at within Masterworks. And you really started to consider it. And by making, a transcription, which is not necessarily a copy, it's basically trying to get down to the structure or the magic of the painting itself, or the image that you're working from. And, seeing that come alive on the page yourself can teach you a lot about overall. It can teach you a lot about how important every single little blade of grass is in this particular work, how maybe feet or hands might point in a way and give the viewer this sort of, it's sort of like an underlying idea of what's happening, or nearly forcing you, like, see how behind your head right at this second, there's two of those little bubble things that are sort of pointing and directing you in a way to each other, right? So there's things like that that happen, or even like the blades of grass that are right near your shoulder. Look at the way they sort of mimic your shoulder to a degree. So there's things like that like the synergies that happen in the work that I think is pretty important to understand, and how they can be sometimes incredibly quiet, yet it's sort of like that subliminal thinking that happens. It's like subliminal messages in art to get you to move around the page in a different way, to get you to think about, like, relationships, because I think our eyes generally, they'll go towards something that's a pattern, but you don't necessarily want it to be an obvious pattern. So a synergy is a type of pattern too. So you might get a same or the similar shape that repeats itself being big or large. And by doing these transcriptions, you actually see sometimes how important these shapes are to the artist, and how they've actually really used them in subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways to create a powerful image, and to create like an image where the viewer is constantly moving around the image. So how to take that and then think about it within your own work. How can you do it so that it's subtle? How can you do it so that it's maybe quiet but really powerful? And, when you think about history, and I talk about this a lot, where a lot of those great masters, they started working in a apprenticeship way from the beginning of ages of like 8 or 10. And then they were actually working with these master artists for like years, like 10 to 12 years, even longer. Some of them never left the workshop, quote unquote, but they became, the person that Bellini would get to do the grass, the person that, Titian would, ask to do, X, Y, and Z. And incidentally, Bellini was one of Titian's, right? So when you see that and you realize that there's this whole lineage of powerful painters, and it feels like now that we forget the power of learning, and we forget the fact that basically you can learn so much from these masters. And even though their work might be historical in context and we don't want to recreate what they've done, we can actually start to examine their underlying structure and hopefully take that into our own work and work out how then best to push that forward for our own sake. So we're not just like, putting something down that we're like, oh my, it's all intuition. Isn't this fabulous, right? Whereas I think intuition can take you so far, and then you really want to start to consider using your mind and using, learned things to actually make the painting stronger structurally and fundamentally, so that it's got this better rhythm moving forward. So by doing a transcription, you begin to delve into somebody else's, a master, not just anyone. It has to be a master work where you're really looking at, Piero della Francesca, or, Giotto, or someone like that, where you're like really understanding that these guys were giants of their times. how can I take some of that philosophy and move it forward for myself? So it's brilliant. So, you know, and what will happen in the class is some people may end up with something that looks specifically like the image that it comes from. Other people might end up with something that's quite abstracted and quite different from that, but there's a better sense of what that structure was from to begin with. And then potentially you can even, you know, do a similar thing with your own work so that you're moving further away from the original, but you're still thinking about the structure that might be able to be incorporated into your own paintings. So it's a big idea, but it's also got very humble ways of actually just exploring it too, which can be brilliant. And I know a lot of people keep going with this idea for years and years, and it feeds into their artwork continually, and they get to like real, and it also, in a way, it's like a key to beginning to understand what they were doing with their paintings. So you're not just, you know, when you go around a museum being like, this is fantastic, and somehow in the back of your mind you're like, well, I know I've got to like it because it's historical and it's got pretty colors and blah, blah, blah. But it actually sits there and says, oh, now I know why, because look at the way that this triangle is formed with the figures on either side, and how maybe that triangle is actually flipped upside down and, you know, comes in from a different way. So it talks about surface geometry, geometry in space, and, you know, how these things repeat themselves constantly. So generally speaking, it's like a snippet, you know, working from a transcription is a snippet into a master's work, and for you to hopefully understand how powerful they are and why they're powerful.
When I think about doing a transcription, I often think about a large painting and then me doing a tiny little pencil sketch of it, or a simplified, maybe a little study in gouache. How big are you thinking about going with these in your workshop?
Given that it's only 2 days, you know, I'd want someone to jump in, hopefully, even at the beginning of the first end day and start with something a little bit bigger. You know, when I've worked and I, you know, went to Italy, I actually got a travel prize at one point from the studio school, and it was a fabulous prize, Hohenberg. And I got to go to Italy and travel around, and I made my own itinerary. So I went from Spain to Italy up to the Czech Republic, and I literally would go into these weird and sometimes wonderful museums and churches and draw directly from the works. And it was fantastic because you actually got to see the actual scale of what you're looking at, and sometimes the power of the scale is where it's at. It'd be fantastic for somebody to even do, you know, something that's life size, meaning the same size as what they've done. But I could also see the benefit of spending the whole weekend doing something that's like this size, so that, you know, you're, you know, able to sit at your, you know, desk and just fully get into it. Because, you know, most of my works, because I was limited on what I was carrying around at the time, and, you know, it was a while ago now, but most of my, and also the museums won't let you in with bigger sizes. But, you know, generally speaking, and I was only in the place for, you know, maybe a day at the most, sometimes 2 or 3, but mainly a day. I'd be there and you'd hone in on a work, and I'd just work intensely for, I don't know, 4, 5, 6 hours just on this small little drawing. So there's a lot to be said for the power of the small, and the fact that you can learn a lot if you're really willing to, you know, think about how am I approaching this? Am I approaching it where I'm just thinking about the figure, or am I approaching it from a bigger underlying idea of the philosophy of the work itself? So to answer your question, I didn't answer your question. Hopefully someone will go large if they're capable of doing it, and that they will get ambitious with it. And just because the workshop ends doesn't mean that they can't continue working on that image as well.
Yeah, this is such a good idea. I would love to do this as an ongoing series. So we'll see how this one goes, and then and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, and sometimes it's about, you know, just getting that little bit of insight into the magic of what these paintings are and being given a little bit of a key on how to get into it, because then you can take this yourself. And, and one of the things that I'm always interested in as a teacher is that, you know, you start to form your own questions. You start to form your own ideas about what's important to you within a work. And so therefore you start to then be the director rather than, going along to a class and, well, I learnt this and I've got to go back to study with this person. You actually start to understand that, wow, I've got choices. I can do this. And I've got these set of questions now that I can go to my work and be like, wow, am I thinking about the center? Am I only thinking about the center? Should I be thinking about something else? What if I move it? So you start to think about all these different considerations. So I'm always interested in how can I teach someone so that they can then go out into the world themselves and really apply this to anything that they're looking at.